Good afternoon, everybody. This is Captain Rich with Stillwaters Fishing. Mid-January, I did a short video just going over some lures that you want to start using pre-spawn time, just testing the shallows to see if they're up there, if they're transitioning near it or around it. So this is going to be a little bit longer form where I'll kind of like get into like the things that I have found while fishing those lures and kind of what the bite feels like now that I've got a couple years underneath my belt with more consistent time on the water. And we hear it all the time. The pros say it. Anybody that does fishing for a living on their platforms, they're always saying time on the water you cannot buy, you cannot replace. And there is a lot to that. So I want to try to shorten that learning curve for you guys. So this time of year, the two things that I always have on the front of the deck of the boat, they never come off, is a half-ounce jig, and I kind of go through a black and blue, or I go a green and brown with like a orange. It's called crawl laminate, like a orange crawl laminate, kind of gray on top, orange on the bottom. So that'll go on my green and brown, and the black and blue gets a hematoma color. I like the hematoma because when the sun comes out, it takes on like a purplish, bluish hue, but if it's dark, it just looks black. So if you've got like dingy water, but you go back and forth through sunny days, cloudy days, like that can serve kind of both purposes, where it takes on some color if there's light, and if there's not, it just looks black, which they can see really well. And I just kind of transition between those two colors. If I get really crazy, not to steal somebody else's words, I'll swap them. So I'll throw a gray and orange on there. I usually don't do that unless I'm getting like nips or little short strikes. If I'm getting like a bite, but then like there's no follow-up, they didn't pick it up, they didn't go away with it, I'll change the color. And the quickest thing to do is just to change the plastic. And that has worked quite a bit. So don't think that that's not a real technique. And that's kind of where I like try to live when I'm trying to figure it out. I want to throw things where I can change the plastic, which changes the profile and the presentation. Shaky heads. So you can go from a worm to a creature bait. That's something that if you're on the hunt and you're looking for them, maybe they're kind of playing ball, but not really. Swap that plastic out real quick. You don't necessarily have to change colors, but if you change the profile, it'll tell you either they liked that direction or you need to go the other way. All right, so we've talked about the jig a little bit. Now, spinnerbait. I love throwing the spinnerbait all year round, but it really shines here in Virginia Beach because we don't have grass, we don't have a lot of depth changes. And if you haven't heard me say it, I'll say it again. In Virginia Beach, around the Norfolk Airport, Lake Smith, Little Creek Reservoir, Lake Whitehurst, if you're on wood, you're good. Well, there's times of years that they're just not on the wood because that's not where they're prepping to be. But we're talking early January coming up for February, March. Now is when you want to start like planning, like what are the weather conditions that I'm looking for when I'm going to go out. Me, myself, and I, if it's 45 degrees with more than a 15-mile-an-hour wind, I know I'm not going to be able to feel my hands. So on days where it's really cold, I'm less apt to go out, but I kind of like still like to get out there, but I'm out of my element, mostly because I can't feel my hands. So you want to start thinking of like, what does my first day on the water look like if I'm not fishing all the way through the winter? Because when it's cold like this, you can still get really good fish. They will play ball. So start building that up, and then what areas are you really good with the spinnerbait and shallow water, square bills, light jigs, stuff like that? Are you better, kind of off with, long bomb, DT6s, 6-foot crankbaits, stuff like that? And start thinking about the areas that you're gonna fish, trying to catch them in the transition. It's not like it's all transition. They kind of yo-yo back and forth depending on the weather. So on warmer days with a mild wind or something like that, they might creep up to clay banks, sand banks, old lily pad beds to get a little sun, get a little warm. And then they'll pull right back off and they'll go to their winter spot. So if you're hunting for those, that's kind of where you want to experiment with different spinner baits, different color jigs, and just kind of track those back and forth. But when you start mapping that out and start planning when you want to see the weather change, what areas you want to go to, and you tie on rigs that I'm telling you right now, if they're in the area and they're going to eat, they will eat them. Not necessarily like the colors. I've thrown white spinner baits. I've thrown white bladed jigs. I've thrown white and red. I've thrown white and blue, white and green pumpkin. They all get eaten. So I tie up my favorite color spinner bait, and I just let that dog eat. All right. So the other day I went out, and we're in that transition period because we've only been in really cold weather for about 2 weeks now. Before that, we were anywhere from 65, 62, almost 70 degrees, back down to 40s. So on those warmer days, they were kind of doing that yo-yo thing. I was fishing a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait with a number 4 Colorado and a number 4.5 willow blade, and I caught them on the south end of the lake. I went to the north end of the lake, see if I could replicate that same bite, old lily pad beds, and I could. So after I caught 2 or 3 with the spinnerbait, I cut it off and I put on a chatterbait. Same areas, blank, nothing. And what I noticed between the two, the spinnerbait and the chatterbait, is that the chatterbait would not maintain the depth in the lily pads. Like when it came up and over, it stayed up, and I had to like kill it to get it to go back down. And then when I started reeling, it would come up a lot faster. Whereas the spinnerbait kind of stayed in that depth zone where I couldn't see it. I could see the flash, but I could not see the skirt, and that's what they were eating. So those are two things that you want to notice and understand. If you go out there and you're throwing a spinnerbait and they're swiping at it and they're not getting it, or you're scaring them, try going to a chatterbait or a vibrating jig and see if bringing something higher up in that water column, maybe they see it better, maybe the vibration's closer to what they're looking for. You just got to kind of play. I always say vibration, vibration, vibration before color. And I'm going to stick to that because that's what I noticed that day was either it was the depth or it was the vibration, but they did not want the chatterbait. The nice thing about throwing a chatterbait or a vibrating jig that has weed guards on it is you can treat it like a jig. You can throw it down there, let it sit, and just like hop it, brr, brr, brr. Or you can change it up. You can do short ones, you can do longer runs, you can speed it, which is really nice. It's a very versatile rig. You just kind of play with that. Jigs, there's plenty of videos out there, long bombs in known areas and just dragging it slow. That almost kills me. Like, I don't have the patience for it, but if you do, like, you can definitely smack a big one. All of my big fish in the wintertime have come off of a spinnerbait, and it's either in lily pads or it's on a big laydown. And I've talked several videos where you've got to make that cast down the laydown and pull that spinnerbait all the way down that thing. Now, if you're not very good at it, you just got to keep doing it. I use 20-pound fluorocarbon because I'm going to be dragging it across a lot of wood. And then if you do get bit, you're probably going to have like a little yo-yo fest while they're in the wood and trying to get out. So it's not that I need the 20-pound fluorocarbon for the pull. I just need it to survive the fight. It's abrasion resistance. The other bait that I like to throw, if they're not hitting either one of those, is a swim jig. Same thing as the vibrating jig. You can treat a swim jig like a jig. It's just sitting there on the bottom, and it moves, and it moves a little bit more. Maybe it hops up a little bit. You can add that action to it. The thing that I've noticed when it gets cold, it's not that they won't hit it. They will. But it's not as aggressive. They're not swallowing this thing and moving out. They'll hit it, and then you've got to kill that. You've got to kill the action. As soon as you feel the bite, stop. Don't do anything. That is when they're going to come back and they're going to pick it up, and they're not going to like swim off like they do in the summertime. They're going to pick it up. You'll feel another bite, burnt, and then you'll feel your line just slowly start to pull as they're going back to their spot or moving out to go find more food. I don't set the hook until I feel, gosh, I got an itchy in my nose. That's horrible. I don't on that when that bite is like that. I do not set the hook until that they pull that rod down to like 3 o'clock. When they've pulled all the slack and my rod is ready for at your comfortable angle for a good hook set, that's when I swing. And in lily pads, any vegetation whatsoever, that rod tip goes up and it stays up the entire time. It's hard enough to get a bite in the cold in the winter, and you can't feel your hands and your toes are gone and it's miserable. You finally got a bite and you're in lily pads, the old lily pad beds. They bite it, they pull it down to where it's a good hook set angle. Rod tip goes up and just stays up. Now you don't have to horse them straight up, because it's not about horsing them out of the water. It's about keeping their head up, because if they get their head down, they can get around those root balls. They can get around another piece of wood, some junk that is laying up in there. You don't want that. You want to tilt the scales your direction. So rod tip goes up, stays up, and you just maintain that slack. Just maintain the pressure on the line. So that's my technique for swim jigs and spinner baits during that time of year. When I've caught 3 or 4 really good fish with the 4 and the 4.5, I'll switch it out to a chandelier. I know the chandelier is more like the Alabama rig. I just call it the chandelier because it sounds like it. So a number 5 and a number 5. And I'll even go as far as to putting like a swim bait on the back of it. Very heavy to throw. 1/2 ounce. By the time you put the blades on there, and the size of the paddle tail, it's probably closer to 3/4 or an entire ounce when you're throwing it. But when that's going through the lily pads, it feels like a helicopter is on the end of your rod. It's a whoosh, 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 whoosh. And I don't know if it's the stronger vibration or the bigger profile, but if I've already caught a couple 4-pounders, maybe a 5-pounder, like I really want, like this is when you go bull hunting. This is when you want your big fish, so you want that bigger profile. So then I'll switch over to that bigger profile, and the fish almost automatically either end of the lake, depending on like if the bite is consistent through the entire part of the lake or just one end, the size of the fish goes up. You can still catch dinks on it, but 7 out of 10 times it's a better fish. And I mean like a monster. If you get out there in February, I mean early February, late January, early February, and you can get to where you're throwing that, you've caught your 3 or 4 good ones, like satisfied on your day out, and you want to go for a bigger bite, that's the next thing you tie on and just stand by. Now it does feel like you've been chopping wood all day when you throw that for an extended period of time, but you increase the size of that profile, you reduce your rate of speed, but it's a bigger thump without going to a larger Colorado blade. And it comes through those lily pads just the same. And you start wanting to back off, make your long bomb with it, and pull it out to where there might be a transition area. So that's kind of my natural progression in the spinnerbait realm. Same thing with that jig follow up. If you get a swipe with a spinnerbait and you don't want to throw at it again, because I don't know what it is around here, but they're one shot wonders. If they swipe at something and you throw it right back in there, hardly ever do they double down on it and then you get them. It's happened a couple times, but I have a lot more success if I put the spinnerbait down and I pick up a jig and I go back and then I just slow drag that thing. They definitely come back and pick that up. So we'll go from lures to rods, reels, line. I use, because I'm old and I can't see like I could anymore, I use 20-pound Vicious No Fade Braid yellow. That's my core line on all my reels, except for my open face reels. Then they get the 10-pound no fray or no fade yellow. That's what I throw on those. So the yellow line I can see, and if I'm looking for line jump when I'm like dragging or something like that, that is super helpful, because smoke green, might as well be invisible for me. I cannot see it. So that's what I use. 20-pound fluorocarbon, that stuff right there. That's what I'm throwing on all my rigs when I'm fishing around wood, heavy vegetation, the lily pads. That's what I use. I used to throw straight braid, but braid, it's hero or zero. Like if you're dragging a spinnerbait over wood with braid, it is just sawing a little groove that's going to lead that spinnerbait right there, and you're going to hang up more times than you're not. Those fluorocarbon leaders have just enough give in, and when I feel it hang, I can wiggle it, and it's not so concrete, because you have no idea how fast and how forceful you're moving something to the water until it stops and your rod almost flies out of your hand. It's like when you're walking and you hit something with your head, you're just walking. It feels like normal everyday business until you meet something that doesn't move and catastrophic failure happens. So that's kind of like the theory on that. That fluorocarbon gives you just enough forgiveness to kind of work your way through that structure. All right, so my favorite, or what I use, I don't know if it's my favorite because I'm not dead yet, is a rod that has a little bit of tip, but a lot of backbone. So a little bit of tip, right? It's flexible, but the backbone on it, I don't know if I can show you guys how this works. The backbone on it is really good. So it's just flexible enough so you don't rip a hole in their mouth and then it pulls out. And it's strong enough to like keep that head up and kind of work them off of wood, out of heavy vegetation. So that's what you're looking for. That's what I use for my spinner baits and my vibrating jigs. Same rod. I use the 20-pound fluorocarbon for my horizontal presentations. Horizontal presentations are, I guess, for me, they feel like there's a little bit more needed out of your reel. So I use a Shimano Bantam MGL. They are expensive, but I'm a Walmart kid. So when I feel something that is like it's worth the dollar, when I tell you the Bantam MGL for horizontal presentations, crankbaits, square bills, chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, anything you're cast and retrieve, that reel is an absolute workhorse. You can feel the quality when you make a cast, when you're reeling it back in, when you have a big one on the line. And out of the 7 MGLs that I have, the drag has never been, catchy. It's always been buttery smooth and dials in right where I want it. If I'm throwing, a heavy spinnerbait in open water or in heavy cover, I can adjust that and it will meet and or exceed my expectation. If I'm throwing a very small crankbait, same reel, different rod, but I can dial that drag in to where, like, I don't want to pull too hard on that because the hooks are smaller. Now the fish might have it all the way in his mouth, but I'm not trying to horse that guy out. And I can dial that drag in really well, and the controls on them, I really like it. If you can, I highly recommend it for dragging things. So my jig rod, most of my rods come from Kissel Crafts rods. I talked to Sean and I tell him kind of what I'm thinking because he uses MHX blanks. And I talk to him and I say, hey, this is the rod blank that I'm thinking, and this is what I'm thinking it's for, and this is what I fish around. And if he thinks you're way off, he'll come back and be like, I'm familiar with that rod blank, mate. Why don't we try this? He's done that for me 2 or 3 times, and I'm not upset at it at all. So this is a Foxtrot Papa 885-74. This is made for a 3/8 to a 1.5 ounce rod. Kind of a broomstick-ish. I mean, it's got a little bend, but like you can see, it's not bending a whole lot, and it's a whole lot of backbone. So that's what I use for my jig rods, or a quick. If I'm just gonna rig up a quick punching rig real quick, I have no problem using this rod at all. This thing will pull heathens out of spots. I've caught several 6-pounders this year off of junk wood, stuff everywhere, and that rod is strong enough to work those bigger fish out of those areas and not so stiff that you're just ripping a hole in their lip. And that's something you gotta watch out for, which is another reason why I went away from straight braid. When they're pulling hard and their mouths are cold, and it's that time of year where like you're trying to horse them out of a spot, if you're going straight braid, you gotta remember it's just a fish, and that barb is only, not, it's like just over a quarter of an inch away from the barb to keep it in their mouth. So if you're on straight braid and you take the tip of your rod and you move it from here to behind you, whoosh, like so, you've just sucked up like 16 feet of line if you got like a 7.5 foot rod, or 12 feet if you only got a 6 foot rod, on a 2 to 6 pound fish. So that braid doesn't allow any forgiveness. All the forgiveness is either in your drag or in your rod. So if you're throwing a broomstick or a stiffer rod and you're fishing straight braid, you might not lose the fish because he came unbuttoned. You might be losing fish because you ripped a giant hole in his head and now the hook falls out because it's got no meat to grab anymore. So that's another thing, another learning curve that I've gone through. Really, like at the end of the day, if all you've got is ugly sticks and everything else, you can build in kind of like that spring tension. You don't have to have expensive line, expensive reel, expensive rod. Like I said, I'm a Walmart kid. I started out with Shakespeare reels and ugly sticks, like the combo, 20 bucks. But what I never realized, because nobody ever told me, is that if you need it to be stiffer because you're dragging something heavier, then throw braid on there. Throw a fatter line on there if you can. Like some of them, they just won't take fatter line. But you can kind of like dial your rig up and down by changing your line. And if you're running a braid, like core line, and then you don't use leaders, try a leader. If you've got a super stiff rod and you throw on 10 pound, I don't think I have any up here right now. Maybe I do. A copolymer, like I use a Vicious copolymer too. It's kind of like a hybrid between a mono and a fluorocarbon, so a lot more stretch, but it still has pretty good abrasion resistance. If you throw that on there, then you're going to build in some spring tension to where you're not yanking the hooks out. Or if you have a really stiff rod, sometimes you feel the bite and you react right out of the gate, and you can't figure out why they're not getting it. They're not getting it because you're feeling it so fast, and then you're jerking it right out of their mouth. You got to give them time to like get it in the mouth. So that's a little bit, I mean, longer form for me, an explanation, because sometimes I feel like it's the blind leading the blind when I'm talking to somebody else about how they could increase their fishing hookup ratios and stuff like that, because it is all trial and error for me. I don't run a lot electronics on my boat, so when I go out fishing, my active sonar is a spinnerbait, is a jig, is a crankbait, telling me like, okay, you're in sand, you're in clay, but now you're in muck. So that kind of like, when you hit the same lakes on a regular basis, you can kind of build up that mental memory of like, this point has, hard compact bottom out to like here, but that should be telling you something. So I want to run that line, or I want a perpendicular to that line. This is where I fish, this is where I don't, stuff like that. And you just start paying attention to where you get the bites. If you're running a crankbait and it's bump, 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 digging, and then all of a sudden it just gets kind of mushy, but that's when you get hit. Okay, well they're sitting there in the muck and they're looking towards the shallows. Vice versa, the same direction. Locating the fish, understanding that when you're getting short strikes, change color, change vibration. Don't go 30 minutes, 300 yards without changing something if you're not getting bit. Stay in those high percentage zones. If you pull up to a point, because it's a high percentage zone and there's wind blowing on, I'm on a wind blowing point. If there are fish out here, they are aggressive. Don't start by throwing a jig and just dragging it. If they're feeling aggressive, they want to chase. That's why they're on the point. Now, if you go out there, you burn a spinnerbait, a vibrating jig, and a crankbait, and you don't find anything, then try the jig. Right? So you want to be efficient at the areas that you're picking to fish. So when you go through your rotation of your rods, you want to be efficient because you want to maximize your time out on the water. Look, if you fish every other weekend for 52 weeks, you're only fishing like 25 days a year, which sounds insulting. Trust me, I understand when you say I fish every other weekend, and then when you break it down, it's I only fish 25 times a year. Like, you're going to need more time on the water to get used and get comfortable to understand what your rig is doing in the water. If you spend more time throwing the same baits, like I can tell you right now that when I'm throwing a half-ounce spinnerbait in this combination, I know when there is a pine needle on it. I can tell you when it caught a leaf. I can tell you when it picked up a stick, when it went over a lily pad, when it hit a twig, because I've thrown it that much. That's what you want to start building now before pre-spawn hits, because some of those hits, was that a hit? I don't know. And then you miss a fish, or it was a hit, but you didn't understand, so you didn't set the hook, right? So you want to start building in how much feel you have for these baits and what they're doing. When you can start dragging a jig or throwing a spinnerbait and be like, that feels like it's got something on it, and then it starts coming up and it does have something on it, that's when you know you're getting dialed into your rig. So when you've pulled a jig or a spinnerbait across wood, across lily pads, over limbs, around trunks, and then all of a sudden it doesn't feel like any of those, set the hook. Swing away. Okay? Because that's all you're doing is building in. When you're fishing the lily pad beds, especially in the springtime when they start to come back, I mean, a spinnerbait in the lily pads is like thump, 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 thump. And then you feel something, it's like whack. Like, it felt different. Because when you first go out there and it's just like thump, 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 I mean, you're setting the hook left and right, like, oh man, I keep getting bit. And you're not getting bit, you're hitting lily pads. But you will get a bite in the lily pads, and it will feel different. You'll start to put the two together. But that comes with that time on the water. So tying them on now, early January, throwing them now, whether you're blanking or not, go to the spots where you think they're going to be. February, March, fish them. Fish them. You might find a stump. You might find a rock. You might find a ledge. You might find out that there's hard bottom where you would normally be sitting, and you should be 30 yards behind you fishing that spot. You can, just because they're not active and they're not biting doesn't mean you can't learn something for the next coming months. I can't even tell you, probably, if I was going to put a number, probably 4 or 5 times I've been in a tournament fishing a spot thinking to myself, well, they should really be here right now, but if they're not, this should kick off in the dog days of summer, when it gets hot, when they go pre-spawn, when they go post-spawn, when it's the fall bite. You know, I look at these spots and I'm thinking to myself, well, that time period, and sure enough, a month down the road, 2 months down the road, I'll remember it, I'll pull up to that spot, and it'll be boom, 4, boom, 4, boom, 5. It wasn't that right time of year, but I learned it a month and a half ago. So that's how valuable your time on the water is. Always try to learn something with every cast. How to fish that stump, how to fish that laydown. There are some laydowns and some stumps I can't fish to save my life. And it doesn't matter what I throw at them. Doesn't matter I'm dead at them, a foot or two off. I get hung each and every time. Do I stop fishing them? No, I just go get my stuff again. All right, so that's all I got for you. If you made it this far, I appreciate it. I hope you got something from it. The biggest thing out there is change your vibration, short strikes, change your color, and just get out there and fish and drag and learn and figure it out. All right, Godspeed.